Somewhere in northern Iraq, carved into a wall that has stood for almost 3,000 years, a winged man is holding a bag. Not a metaphor, not a trick of the light. An actual handbag, squared at the bottom, with a stiff handle arching over the top, gripped in his fist the exact same way you'd carry one off a store shelf today. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The same object shows up on a stone pillar in Turkey that predates the invention of farming. It shows up again on a carved slab in the jungles of Mexico, on the other side of an ocean nobody in the ancient world was supposed to be able to cross. 3 continents, thousands of years apart, zero contact between any of them, according to everything we've been taught. So why does the same object keep showing up in the hands of gods who never should have met each other? Stay with me, because the answer isn't in a museum vault or a government file. It's been sitting in plain, readable text for over a century, and almost nobody has actually looked at it. Let's start with where this image is sharpest and easiest to see, because that's where the whole conversation usually begins. In the 800s BCE, an Assyrian king named Ashurnasirpal II built himself a palace in a city called Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, on the banks of the Tigris River. This wasn't a home. It was a machine built to intimidate. Every wall in the throne room was lined with carved stone panels, floor to well above eye level, and marching down those walls in repeating formation were figures that were not quite human. Muscled bodies, richly detailed robes, and enormous wings rising from their backs. Some had the heads of bearded men wearing horn crowns, the ancient symbol for divinity. Others had the heads of eagles, sharp-beaked and staring. These beings are known to us as the Apkallu, legendary sages from Mesopotamian tradition, said to have existed before the Great Flood and to have handed humanity the gifts of civilization itself. And in the left hand of these towering guardians, held low and casual like something they carried every single day, is that shape. A rigid handle, a squared, flat-bottomed body, a silhouette so close to a modern handbag that it stops people scrolling every time it shows up online. Now, before we go any further, there's one thing that has to be said clearly, because it changes how the rest of this story should land in your mind. There is no physical handbag. Nobody has ever pulled an actual object like this out of the ground. There is no artifact sitting in a case somewhere that archaeologists refuse to open. What exists are carvings, images, a shape depicted by different cultures, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. So when you see a video promising that scientists have finally cracked open the mysterious Sumerian handbag, understand exactly what that means. You can't open a picture carved into stone. What you can do is read what the people who carved it actually wrote down about it, and look closely at the rest of the scene they left us. That's what we're going to do here all the way through, and by the end, I think this is going to feel far stranger and far more human than the version of the story that usually goes viral. Here's the detail almost nobody mentions when they share these images: the winged figure's other hand. While the left hand holds the bag-shaped object down by his side, the right hand is doing something too. It's raised, often up near chest height, holding a smaller object shaped a little like a pine cone or a closed flower bud. And that hand isn't just resting. In relief after relief, it's extended, angled outward, aimed towards something, usually a stylized, elaborately woven tree design that scholars simply call the sacred tree, or sometimes toward the king himself. 2 objects, 2 hands, 1 clear gesture. And that pairing is the thread that unravels the entire mystery once you decide to actually follow it instead of cropping it out of the frame. Before we pull on that thread, though, it's worth sitting inside that throne room for a moment because the setting tells you almost as much as the object does. This wasn't decoration in the way we think of art hanging on a wall. It was function. The winged guardians were carved at doorways, at thresholds, at the exact points where the ancient Mesopotamian imagination believed danger and misfortune were most likely to slip through into a sacred or royal space. They lined the passage that any foreign ambassador, tribute bearer, or nervous local governor had to walk before reaching the king. Every single one of them carried the same 2 objects, the same gestures, panel after panel, across different sculptors and different decades of work. That kind of consistency isn't accidental. When a culture repeats a specific detail with that much discipline across that much time, it's because the detail carried weight. It meant something precise enough that getting it wrong wasn't an option. Now widen the lens, because this is where the story stops being a single palace and starts becoming a genuine puzzle. Travel roughly 500 miles northwest into the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, and you reach a site called Göbekli Tepe. This is one of the most quietly staggering archaeological sites on Earth. Its oldest layers date back to roughly 9,600 BCE, which puts it more than 11,000 years in the past. The people who built it had no cities, no writing, no metal tools, and quite possibly no farming yet at all. They were hunter-gatherers, and somehow they organized the labor to haul multi-ton limestone pillars upright and arrange them into massive rings, carving them with startlingly lifelike animals. On one of those pillars, cataloged as Pillar 43 and nicknamed the Vulture Stone by researchers, there's a dense, busy composition. Vultures with wings spread, a scorpion with its tail curled, snakes, birds, and shapes that are still debated. And near the top, arranged in a tidy row, are three small carved forms. Square bodies, a curved line arching over each one. To a modern eye that's already primed by the Assyrian image, they look almost exactly like the same handled object carved more than 7,000 years before that Assyrian palace was ever built. Just sit with that number for a second, because it's the whole engine of this mystery. 7,000 years separates the pillars of Göbekli Tepe from the walls of Nimrud. That's a longer stretch of time than separates those Assyrian carvings from us. Right now, today, when those Turkish pillars were raised, the Sumerians didn't exist yet as a civilization. Writing hadn't been invented. The pyramids of Egypt were still thousands of years away. There's no scribe, no trade route, no plausible chain of contact that could carry an idea from one to the other across that gap. And yet there they are, three-handled shapes, watching over a scene of dangerous animals, staring out from the deepest part of the human past, asking a question that's very hard to just walk away from. How does the same object show up on both ends of a 7,000-year silence with nothing connecting them? And the shape wasn't finished traveling yet, because the next place it turns up isn't anywhere near the Near East at all. It's in the tropical lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Tabasco, at a site called La Venta, a major center of the Olmec civilization, the culture many archaeologists consider the foundational, mother culture of later Mesoamerican societies like the Maya and the Aztec. La Venta flourished somewhere between roughly 1200 and 400 BC, meaning parts of its history actually overlap with the era of the Assyrian palaces, despite being on the opposite side of the planet. Among the carved monuments the Olmec left behind is one cataloged as Monument 19. It shows a seated human figure wrapped inside the coiled body of a massive serpent, its open mouth arching over the man's head like a canopy. He sits calmly inside that frame, one hand raised, the other resting at his side, and in that resting hand is an object with a squared body and a rigid handle curving above it. The same silhouette as the Assyrian guardian. The same silhouette as the three shapes above the vultures in Turkey. Now appearing on a continent that, according to virtually all accepted history, had no contact whatsoever with Mesopotamia or Anatolia. La Venta sits more than 7,000 miles from Nimrud. Oceans between them, mountain ranges, deserts. Thousands of years of civilizations developing entirely on their own, with no documented trade, no shared script, no evidence of a single boat crossing that gap. And still, the object in the Olmec figure's hand and the object in the Assyrian guardian's hand look, at a glance, like the exact same tool. Once you line those three images up side by side, Turkey, Iraq, Mexico, it stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like a signal. And once your brain locks onto that pattern, it starts finding it everywhere. People point to Maori oral tradition, where a hero named Tawaki ascends into the heavens and returns to Earth carrying three baskets containing sacred knowledge, three vessels of divine wisdom, which some see as echoing that row of three shapes on the Turkish pillar. People point to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, where a small sign shaped like a squared enclosure with a domed handle over it represents the word for a god's shrine or dwelling place. The house of the divine drawn as a handle container. People point to painted scenes in Egyptian tombs where deities hold small bags in their fists, containers whose contents the paintings never actually explain. Stack all of that together, a pre-agricultural Turkish pillar, an Assyrian throne room, an Olmec serpent monument, a Polynesian myth of baskets falling from the sky, an Egyptian symbol for a god's house, and the pattern feels dizzying. A handled container tied again and again to gods, to sacred knowledge, to the boundary between the human world and something above it. Once you've seen the sequence laid out like that, it's genuinely hard to unsee it. So let's give the biggest theory here a fair hearing, because it deserves one, and dismissing it outright only makes it more compelling to the people who believe it. The strongest version of the argument goes like this. Human cultures are wildly inventive and wildly different from each other. They build differently, dress differently, bury their dead differently, and imagine the faces of their gods differently. So when two completely disconnected cultures land on the exact same specific object and attach that object to the exact same kind of meaning, divinity, sacred power, a bridge between heaven and earth, that agreement demands an explanation beyond blind chance. According to this theory, something has to connect them. Either a single, older, forgotten civilization that spread its symbols across the globe long before recorded history and then vanished without a trace, or visitors from somewhere beyond our world entirely, remembered imperfectly by witnesses who carved the closest approximation they could of what they saw, a glowing figure carrying a container of something powerful. It's a compelling story, and it's compelling precisely because it takes the pattern seriously instead of brushing it aside. But a strong theory has to survive its hardest question, not just explain the evidence that supports it. And there's one question that the lost global civilization theory has never been able to answer convincingly. If an ancient, advanced culture really did spread across the entire planet and teach every society it touched the same sacred symbol, why is a handbag basically the only thing they all have in common? Where's the shared alphabet? Where's the common system of measurement, the matching construction technique, the shared calendar, the loanwords bleeding from one ancient language into another, the way real, sustained contact between cultures always leaves a trail? Actual cultural exchange throughout history has always been messy and abundant. When two peoples genuinely meet and trade, they don't just swap one symbol. They swap crops, diseases, phrases, gods, building methods, dozens of things at once. A civilization advanced enough to circle the entire globe, but that left behind exactly one shape, and nothing else isn't really a civilization at all in any meaningful sense. It's just a shape. And shapes, as it turns out, have a habit of being invented independently, over and over again, by people who never met, for reasons that are almost disappointingly ordinary. To understand why, we need to stop staring at the bag and go back to that second hand, the one almost nobody talks about, because that's where this entire mystery quietly comes apart. Across relief after relief on the Assyrian palace walls, the winged guardian isn't just carrying a container. He's reaching out with his other hand, toward the sacred tree or toward the king, holding that small cone-shaped object between his fingers, angled and raised in the unmistakable gesture of someone about to flick liquid through the air. Archaeologists, scholars who study the cuneiform texts of ancient Mesopotamia, have a name for this pairing straight from the source texts themselves. The container is called a bandidu, an ordinary Akkadian word for an ordinary bucket, the same kind of vessel a laborer might use to carry water or mud. The cone-shaped object is called a mullalu, a purifier or sprinkler. Once you know those two words and see how consistently they appear together in ritual texts alongside these carvings, the entire scene changes meaning. This isn't a god clutching some sealed container of forbidden, mysterious power. It's a purification ritual, frozen in stone at the exact moment of performance. Bucket in one hand, holding a consecrating liquid, likely water, possibly mixed with oil or fragrant resin. Sprinkler in the other, dipped into that liquid and flicked outward toward whatever was being blessed or protected, in a gesture that would look strikingly familiar to anyone who has watched a priest sprinkle holy water down a church aisle in a much later tradition entirely. And this is the part that deserves to be said as plainly as possible, because it's the piece almost never included in the viral versions of this story. The Assyrians told us what this object was. They wrote it down. The words bandidu and mululu appear repeatedly in their own ritual and administrative texts, describing this exact combination of bucket and sprinkler used in purification ceremonies. When archaeologists have recovered actual bronze buckets of this shape from Mesopotamian palace ruins and tested the residue inside them, what they found lines up with that mundane, human explanation. Traces of water and plant matter consistent with ritual purification, not evidence of some lost advanced technology. Nobody needs to crack open a magic handbag to find the answer here. It was carved into the wall the entire time, in the second hand, that most people simply never bother to follow. So then why does a similar silhouette turn up at Göbekli Tepe and across an ocean in Mexico, if the Assyrian meaning really is this specific and this local? Here's where the honest answer becomes a lot more interesting than the alien explanation, not less. Think about the actual physical problem being solved. If you need to carry liquid or any kind of contents by hand without spilling it, without soaking your fingers, and without having to set it down constantly, there are only so many practical shapes that solve that problem well. You need a body wide enough to hold volume, a flat base so it can stand upright on its own, and a handle arching over the top, so a hand can grip and lift it without touching whatever's inside. A square body and a curved handle. That's simply the shape a human hand tends to arrive at almost immediately, independent of culture, independent of era, because the problem it's solving is universal. Different peoples, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, kept reinventing that same basic form for the same unremarkable reason they independently invented the pot, the woven basket, and eventually the wheel, because they were solving the same physical problem, and useful solutions to shared problems tend to converge, even with zero contact between the people solving them. And once you actually read the context surrounding each carving instead of just the silhouette, the apparent connections start to dissolve into separate, self-contained stories. The three shapes on that Turkish pillar sit among vultures and scorpions in a scene that predates writing entirely, one we still can't fully interpret in its own right. The object gripped by the seated figure inside the serpent's mouth in Mexico belongs to a distinctly Mesoamerican world of feathered deities and rain ceremonies that has no documented connection to the Tigris River Valley whatsoever. The Maori story of baskets of knowledge and the Egyptian symbol for a god's dwelling each grow out of their own mythology, their own language, their own reasons for existing, completely independent of Mesopotamia. Line the images up next to each other, and the outline agrees. Read the actual context surrounding each one, and that agreement quietly falls apart into several unrelated, local meanings that simply happen to land on a similar practical shape. But here's where an honest telling of this has to slow down and refuse to hand you a neat, tidy ending, because that explanation only fully closes the Mesopotamian half of the mystery. It doesn't close all of it. Göbekli Tepe is the piece that keeps its power no matter how the rest of the puzzle resolves. Pillar 43 was carved by people who had no writing system at all. There's no ritual text to consult. No scribe who left behind a word explaining what those three shapes meant to the hunter-gatherers who raised that stone more than 11,000 years ago. The idea that humans can independently converge on a useful, practical shape tells us they very plausibly could have carved a handled container on their own, without any outside influence. What it can't tell us is what that shape meant to them, why they placed it above a procession of vultures and a scorpion, or whether it carried anything close to the meaning a bucket held for a purification priest in Assyria 7,000 years later. On that pillar, the shape is completely real, and its true meaning is completely unknown. And a genuinely honest investigation has to be willing to leave that question open, rather than dressing up an absence of evidence as a tidy answer, just because a tidy answer feels more satisfying. So here's where this actually lands after everything. The so-called handbag of the gods was never going to be opened because there was never a single object to open in the first place. The Assyrian version of this shape has a name, a partner object, a documented ritual, and a purpose we can read directly from the people who carved it. A purification bucket held alongside a ritual sprinkler. That part of the mystery is about as thoroughly solved as ancient history ever gets. The echoes of that same shape across other cultures are, for the most part, the fingerprint of an extremely useful design that the human mind keeps arriving at independently again and again, because carrying things by hand is a problem every culture on Earth has had to solve. And underneath all of that sits one genuinely open door on a windswept hillside in southeastern Turkey, older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the wheel, quietly refusing to explain itself. Maybe there's more connecting the ancient world than we currently understand.